So at this time, we'll get started. Want to thank everybody for being with us at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. For those who don't know, I'm Chris Watson, Director of Communications, joined by Dr. Robert Zayas, the NYSPHSAA Executive Director. Obviously, we had scheduled this call to get you guys all together and up to date and up to speed on what transpired last week with the return to interscholastic athletics document. But timing is everything in life, and you guys timed this out well. So an announcement was made today that I think you were all pretty aware of and hopefully got the press release about. And I'll let Dr. Zayas kind of get you up to speed as what transpired today.
Thank you, Waddy, and I appreciate everybody joining us so late on a Wednesday evening. I do appreciate your time, and I appreciate your passion and enthusiasm for interscholastic athletics. I do want to point out first and foremost that as we have been doing for the past 6 months, decisions are being made in a very rapid fashion. They're being based upon readily available information, and as we get that information, our association is making decisions. We've been very careful not to attempt to predict into the future. Once we have information, once we have guidance, once we have feedback from our member schools, at that point in time, we have been making decisions, and we've been very careful not to attempt to look too far into the future and predict what's going to be happening. We've also made it a point to be flexible. I think during a crisis like this, we have to be flexible. We have to be open to being innovative. We have to be open to being creative, and we have to be focused on doing what's in the best interest of the student athletes that we serve. With that being said, our association today, the officers of our association made a decision to postpone the high-risk fall sports to the spring season. And those high-risk fall sports include competitive cheerleading in the fall, volleyball, and football. Now, what this means is that on March 1st, we will have a second fall season, essentially. There will be an impact upon the spring sports season. Instead of starting spring sports on March 15th, we will begin the spring sports season on April 19th. We will have a bit of an overlap in between the end of the second fall season and the beginning of the spring sports season. This decision was focused on attempting to provide those football and volleyball athletes and competitive cheerleaders who compete in competitive cheerleading in the fall with the opportunity to have a quality participation experience. It was going to be very difficult to provide that to student athletes right now with their only ability to practice until additional authorization is granted. So with that being said, I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you may have. And Chris, I think we're going to go ahead and handle the similar way that we've done this the last few times.
Yeah, if we could, can we utilize the chat feature since we've got, at last chat, we're up to 65 people on the call. So please put your questions in the chat. I think we will find many of the questions are the same and there's a little repetition, which will be good for time. Obviously, you guys are all on deadline, and I think we're all anxious to get the night concluded. So use the chat feature. I'll do my best to play traffic cop with the questions. And we'll start with Lindsay Kramer from Syracuse. Can you review the revised spring schedules? And you guys are going quick for me. Will athletes who play football and volleyball be able to play spring sports as well?
Most certainly. And I think that's the reason why you see the season implemented in the manner that we're trying to implement it, so to speak. I mean, when you look at what we've done is we've taken football and volleyball and competitive cheerleading, and we've started those on March 1st. Those sports will run March 1st, potentially through the end of April. And then spring sports will start on April 19th. So there'll be essentially about a 2-week overlap from when the second fall sports season ends and the spring sports season begins. Whether those students will be able to play in both the second fall season, football, volleyball, for example, and then also participate in a spring sport, baseball, and softball, is up to the discretion of those sections to go ahead and allow those students to participate in 2 seasons at one time. But it was very important to us that the overlap was reduced. You may recall a few months ago when we talked about implementing the condensed season model, that was a major concern of our membership. So I'm hoping that the decision made today is evidence that we've been listening to the concerns of our member schools, and we reduced that overlap from what was originally about 4 weeks down to 2 weeks.
Okay. Robert, you don't have to necessarily give a statement on this. Frank Wolf is just asking, can you repeat the start date? Do you want to just go over the dates one more time?
Yeah, very important to note, the low and moderate risk sports for those schools that wish to play in the fall, there has been no changes. Those low and moderate risk sports will start on September 21st as previously announced. The football and volleyball seasons will be starting on March the 1st, 2021. And then the spring sports will start on April 19th, 2021.
So there's an update on the dates. David in Utica, how many games will the fall sports have in the second fall season, which starts in March?
With the reduced season, we're hoping to get as many games as we possibly can for those student athletes to have a quality, beneficial participation experience. And again, that was one of our concerns, was right now student athletes in those high-risk fall sports were just going to be allowed to practice until the additional authorization was provided. And we listened to the concerns of the member schools, and we were able to go ahead and try to find a way to provide these students with a better quality participation experience.
Michael Kelly, just around the corner from us, will NYSPA sponsor state tournaments for football and volleyball?
No, that decision stands. The fall sports will not have regionals or state championships. Realize we're going to be in a very much condensed season when we enter into that March 1st start date. We're also going to have challenges with inclement weather. That's a guarantee. But again, it's a difference of telling students that they're going to be given the opportunity to practice this fall and potentially play. So hopefully the situation will be a little different in March and April, and those students will be afforded the opportunity to actually participate.
Okay, Eugene has a laundry list of questions in a row. So if I start to go too long with his questions, I'll move on. And again, if you're on the phone or on the computer, if you could mute, it would be very beneficial to all parties involved. So let's start with the top of Eugene's wish list. Can athletes play 4 seasons, fall, winter, fall 2, and spring?
Yes.
Okay. Has the winter season been altered in any way? It usually ends around March with the spring being delayed. Has it been extended past its usual date?
At this point in time, the winter season has not been impacted.
Any state championships scheduled for the winter, fall 2, and spring? You just covered fall 2. No, winter and spring still on, correct?
The winter and spring state championships are still scheduled, and we've answered a lot of questions about that. We have to have a benchmark. If we're going to revise or amend state championships for the winter and spring, I think it's important that we have a benchmark to work off of. And then if we do have to revise or modify those state championship dates, then we can go ahead and revise off of the originally scheduled dates.
Eugene asking, specific to him, his area of the state is just a short drive away to New Jersey, but obviously there are other states playing football as well. Kind of a tough position for a football student athlete in New York to see other states playing football right now.
Yeah, I can completely sympathize with that. I've been a huge advocate for the sport of football, not just here in New York, but nationally. I do work with the NFL, USA Football, and our national governing body. But over the course of the past 2 days, I have hosted 7 Zoom meetings for nearly 500 athletic directors. And I've listened to the concerns of those athletic directors. I've listened to them express their questions and express their concerns about high-risk sports. This decision is being made as a result of listening to our membership and attempting to assist them with the hosting of high-risk fall sports at some point during the 2021 school year.
Okay, Eugene's got 2 more left. If football starts on 3/1, when could they start playing games?
Well, if football starts on March the 1st, then they would have to have what we're looking at right now is 12 practices before they would be permitted to start any scrimmages or games.
All right, final one from him. How much of an overlap for fall 2 and the spring sports season? You may have already
looking at potentially 2 weeks. But keep in mind, the end date for any season is up to the discretion of their individual sections. We're recommending that fall season 2 end on March the 1st, but that's solely up to the discretion of each of our 11 sections.
Let's see. Is there an end date for spring season 2? Phil Blackwell. Is there an end date for spring season 2 as there is for fall sports?
Right now, I think we have to be, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have to be flexible. If we're going to give these students an opportunity to participate, we have to be flexible and we have to continue to examine and analyze as much as we possibly can. Right now, the spring sports season is scheduled to conclude sometime in mid-June. If there isn't a Regents exam, or we can work with the state education department and our school superintendents, there may be an opportunity to extend later in June, but that's all yet to be determined. Right now, we're focusing on the fall sports seasons. Once we can go ahead and take care of those student athletes, then we'll start looking at winter and spring.
I don't know if we can specifically comment on data that was used in this decision, but Robert, if you want to expand on the decision-making process and what, was kind of the tipping point when it came to making this decision today.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I mean, once we released the Return to Interscholastic Athletics document on Friday evening, we scheduled various Zoom meetings with sections throughout the state. And we started those Zoom meetings on Tuesday morning, and we concluded them yesterday afternoon. And what we found was that students are being subjected to having to make decisions. And there's an awful lot of concerns about the high-risk fall sports. So with that being said, we had to make the decision to go ahead and move the football and volleyball seasons to March in an effort to listen to the concerns expressed by our member schools through those Zoom meetings that we hosted.
Billy's question: the rationale for cheerleading and volleyball cheerleading and volleyball being high-risk sports, the same as football. Robert, you can obviously expand on it, but that is a Department of Health guideline as far as how they were qualified, correct?
Exactly. The Department of Health has categorized sports as low, moderate, and high. That's been the same risk assessment that they've utilized since the middle of June, when the Department of Health came out with their original youth sports and recreation guidance focused on youth sports in mid-June.
Was any consideration given for football maybe going to 7-man touch football or playing volleyball outside like some states have done?
Yeah, there's an awful lot of things that are taking place throughout the country. And keep in mind, I'm in direct contact with every other executive director throughout the United States. And I'm in very close contact with the Northeastern executive directors. We talk once a week. There wasn't consideration for modifying the type of season. I think the decision that we've made today is based upon the expressed concerns of our athletic administrators and member schools. And there hasn't been any desire to modify the game of football by going to a 7-on-7 or going to outdoor volleyball courts. I think the decision that we made today, it's our goal that we'll be able to provide a quality participation experience for those student athletes in the midst of the crisis that we continue to deal with.
Kevin asks, is there a concern about coaches who might coach 2 teams, a football and a lacrosse coach? What would you do if you coached both?
Yeah, most certainly. There's a concern about student athletes playing 2 sports. There's a concern about coaches coaching 2 sports. There's also a concern about officials officiating 2 sports. But when you look at the overlap being only 2 weeks, by the time they get the required number of practices and start playing games, that overlap between when the actual games start and when the fall season 2 would conclude is going to be very minimal.
Sorry about that. David asks, how much will the second fall season overlap with the spring? I feel like we covered that. Will a football player be able to play baseball during that same overlap?
And that's going to be up to the discretion of the sections. I think our sections are willing to do whatever it takes to provide participation experiences for their student athletes. And I think that's going to have to be the model that we're going to continue to employ as we look at addressing this ongoing crisis.
Okay, one of the things we've talked a lot about, which was in our document, which was in the DOH document, guidance from the state, guidance from the governor when it came to high-risk sports. Did you expect that soon? Do you think that might come? Any stance on that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been in contact with state officials for a number of months, and they've been very helpful. But the guidance that we received from the Department of Health stated that a decision or authorization on high-risk fall sports would come prior to December 31st. And we respect the fact that there's an awful lot going on with this crisis. We also understand that our member schools have concern in addressing any sports, especially those high-risk sports. So again, those are some of the reasons that we looked at as being justification and rationale for making this decision today.
Keith asked a question about eligibility, and I think we've already covered it, but you correct me if I'm wrong. Will students be able to play a fall sport in the fall, then play football and volleyball in the fall sports season too?
Yes, that is a possibility.
Did the report, okay, so Steve asks about other COVID cases. There's a report, I guess 1,000 football games have been played and no COVID attested to or linked to it. Did that come into any consideration today?
Well, I mean, there's an awful lot going on throughout the country that we're fully aware of, but we're the state of New York and we have to address the situation with the challenges and obstacles that we have placed before us. And I think when you look at the decision that we made today, it's focused on what's in the best interest of those student athletes with the readily available information that we have access to.
Let's see. That was Steve. Alexa's up next. Does this affect winter sports like basketball and hockey?
Well, right now, winter hockey and right now, basketball in the winter, ice hockey, and wrestling are considered high-risk sports by the Department of Health. So as we start getting closer to the beginning of the winter season, which right now is scheduled to start on November 30th, we'll continue to provide guidance as to what our member schools are allowed to do as that season begins if additional authorization has yet to be provided.
Okay. Liana texted me. Liana, are you good? Give me a thumbs up if your question was already answered. She's up. Okay. Liana said she's all set.
No idea.
Ryan Sherman, if you can go on mute, that would be appreciated. Ryan Sherman, if you could go on mute, that would be appreciated. Thank you so much. He often needs to be muted. All right. Mario asked, what did the governor's office and the Department of Health tell you about high-risk sports not being able to play in New York as opposed to other states that were around New York?
Yeah, we haven't gotten into that type of detail with the state officials. What we have discussed is how can we provide participation opportunities for students with the guidance that we've been provided, which was the rationale for the comprehensive document that we released on Friday evening. Our staff, our COVID task force, our section executive directors took a great deal of time to put together a comprehensive document that our member schools could use as a resource to help guide them through the starting of interscholastic sports this fall.
Hey, I'll go off the chat for a second. I got a text question that says football in related to practice, now that football is now a fall 2 season, can you practice in the traditional fall or do you have to wait for football practice?
The only parameters that our member schools have to abide by for off-season conditioning workouts are that they have to abide by the Department of Health regulations for low, moderate, and high-risk sports, and they also have to have off-season conditioning workouts that are open to the entire student body, and they cannot be mandatory. But there's specific guidance for each level of sport from the Department of Health that schools must abide by, whether they're in season or conducting off-season conditioning workouts.
Okay. Next question in the chat is Jesse McWilliam, but I think we covered that, talking about surrounding states playing sports and New York not able to in some cases. I feel like we covered that. Lindsey Kramer, are there concerns about the potential back-to-back football seasons, in the spring of 21 and then again back in the fall of 21?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely something that's been discussed. I serve on our National Governing Body Sports Medicine Advisory Committee. Early on in the COVID crisis, that was a topic that was discussed amongst our committee. That is something that we'll be consulting with our safety committee upon and making sure that we're putting students in a situation that minimizes risk. So if there are any concerns, we can certainly address that as the time continues to progress towards the fall 2021 season.
Okay. Matt asks about, are all playoffs canceled for 2021? No, the fall season is, but as of right now, winter and spring still on, correct, Robert?
That is correct. We're waiting to make the decision on winter state championships and spring state championships. We're still 6 months away from what is the scheduled start of the winter state championships, and we're about 9 months away from the scheduled start of the spring state championships. We, again, need to wait for the readily available information, and then we'll make decisions based upon that. But to start predicting what the situation is going to be like in March is just simply way too early.
I'm going to merge the next 2 questions together from Phil and Alexa. We talked about football practicing in the fall. Do they still need 12 practices before they play in March? And then will they be able to have a preseason in the fall, which again, I think we kind of talked about what they can do in the fall.
Yeah, I don't understand the dynamics of preseason in the fall. Right now, the officers of the association have stated that football would require 12 practices. And the reason why that is we're cognizant of the fact that now, even that we're pushing football off to March 1st, there may be some student athletes that haven't been participating, haven't been as active as maybe they should have been during the layoff. So to have a few more practices to ensure that those student athletes are a little bit more ready for conditioning and a little bit more ready for competition, I think is a wise decision for us to make. But again, those types of decisions can be addressed with our established safety committee that we'll be meeting with several times leading up to the start of all of our sports seasons.
Okay. Billy asked, does the back end of the spring sports calendar change with a delayed start date?
It certainly could. What we're looking at right now is the spring sports season is scheduled to conclude in mid-June. If we can work with the state education department, and depending upon what the status of the regents exams are, and with guidance and consultation with our school superintendents, there may be an opportunity for us to move the spring sports season to end later in June. But again, those are the types of things that we're going to continue to work on, and we'll do what's in the best interest of the student athletes.
Okay. Miguel asks about football and volleyball. Could they engage in off-season voluntary activities once low-risk sports begin? And the second part, unrelated, the plan is to keep ice hockey and ice hockey and wrestling in the winter, even though they're high risk as of right now.
And that is the plan. If high-risk sports are going to conduct off-season conditioning workouts, they need to conduct workouts as per the Department of Health guidance. And that guidance states that individual or distance group training and organized no or low contact group training must exist. So when you look at what are the parameters, what is the type of practice sessions that a high-risk sport can conduct in the off-season, that has to be in accordance with the Department of Health guidance.
Okay. Rachel asked a question that we kind of semi-touched on, but maybe it needs a little further explanation. Can you talk about the elements of the decision-making process with the three sports that are getting pushed, data that was analyzed, not really knowing long-term data about health impacts to COVID, any of that come into play?
Yeah, I mean, when we met with almost 500 athletic directors over the course of the past 2 days, it became very evident there was concerns of our membership. And I'm a firm believer. I'm just started my 9th year as executive director, and I've constantly talked about us being a membership-led organization. So when I had the opportunity to visit with nearly 500 athletic directors and answer their questions and address their concerns pertaining to this crisis, it became very evident that there was serious concerns about the hosting of high-risk sports this fall. And I think we used that as justification and rationale that we had to listen to our member schools, and we have to provide them with some solutions to the problems that they were bringing to us as their state high school athletic association.
And I think that answer kind of serves for the next two questions. Mark, we touched on your question about football practice. So this is Jordan and Rachel both asking what were some of the concerns you heard from the ADs and the members about the high-risk sports, which I think that was...
I think when you look at the guidance that we received from the Department of Health, the concerns that we heard was, what are those student athletes going to be able to do at the beginning of their season when they start on September 21st? And then all the way to the point of, are we going to ask football players and volleyball players to potentially practice for 4 or 5 weeks without the opportunity to participate in a game? That was a real concern. There was also concerns about having more students participating multiple sports right now with everything else the school district is trying to implement. There was concerns about locker room use. There was concerns about weight rooms. There was concerns about socially distancing during practice. So all of those things came together to say, is it absolutely necessary to attempt to host high-risk sports right now without truly knowing whether they were going to be able to have a season this fall, and with the option of being able to move those high-risk fall sports to the month of March.
Okay, I'll give you half a second to catch your breath. I'm just catching up in the chat. James Johnson got booted out of the session and is back in. Can you give James permission to record, and then we can pick back up where we left off? James is back on board.
Got that, Waddy.
Okay, thanks. I left off with David, who I need to find David's question real quick, and bear with me. Okay, the 7-day rule, will that be waived for the second fall season?
That is yet to be determined. I imagine it would be, but we haven't even addressed that at this point in time.
Okay, Matt Fortunato asks, is basketball moderate? No, basketball is a high-risk sport as defined by DOH, correct?
It is a high-risk sport as defined by the Department of Health, along with ice hockey and wrestling in the winter season.
Okay. Greg Brunell asked a question on the fall low and medium impact sports. The guidelines say players must wear a mask unless they can't tolerate it. I don't have the exact wording. What determines that? If the individual player decides they can't tolerate it, who kind of makes that decision and where does that go?
Yeah, we really paid special attention to this in the resource document that we released to our member schools, because this was a major concern of our membership. Keep in mind that the guidance that we received from the Department of Health pertaining to face coverings is the same exact guidance, verbiage from the Department of Health that youth sports were given way back in mid-June for participation this summer. Basically, the face covering guidance from the Department of Health says if students cannot maintain 6 feet social distance, then they are required to wear a face covering. That's the Department of Health guidance. It goes on to say that students are required to wear a face covering unless they cannot tolerate the face covering during physical activity. And nowhere in the guidance does it stipulate that the student must have a note from a parent or a note from a physician or any kind of documentation from the school. The guidance is very clear that it says if the student cannot tolerate the face covering, then that's where the guidance ends, and the student would be able to then not wear a face covering during physical activity. But if they're on the bench and they cannot maintain 6 feet from their teammates, then they must have a face covering on, and that goes for coaches as well.
Yep. That was a popular one. We have heard a lot about face coverings. We talked about it with all the sections and the sport coordinators as well. Mike Catalana in Rochester, are playoffs in the fall 2 season up to the individual sections?
Yeah, I think it's going to be challenging to attempt to host any kind of a culminating event or a playoff in the season 2 starting in March, just with how condensed the season's going to be. But that's completely up to the discretion of those sections if they're able to figure that out.
Michael Kelly, will football, volleyball, and cheer athletes be able to practice in an off-season team workouts starting September 21st? We hit that already, correct?
As long as they abide by the Department of Health guidance, we are really trying to make sure our membership understands what are the practice requirements for off-season conditioning.
Frank Wolf, this is a good question. Robert, up to you how deep you can get into this. Have the guidelines for football practices changed in terms of having contact, scrimmages, things of that nature?
Well, I think that's as I referenced a moment ago, and we're going to be updating our Return to Interscholastic Athletics document tomorrow to further benefit our member schools with the guidance that we've received from state officials pertaining to what are exactly the requirements and restrictions associated with low, moderate, and high-risk sports when they're participating in an off-season conditioning workout.
Okay. Matt Spielman, Governor Cuomo let the parents and families decide if their children would attend in-person school where available. Why not leave the sports decisions up to the families and parents?
Yeah, I've learned a long time ago not to attempt to speak for anyone else. I can tell you that we respect the decisions of our state officials. We've been working very closely with them. They've been helpful to our association as we navigate this very difficult and unprecedented time.
Okay. I left off at Matt. That takes me to Mario. So right now we have no guidance as to what will allow high-risk sports to play. More specifically, high-risk sports, when we can get them going, we need further guidance, correct?
Well, I think that was a part of the decision as well, is we didn't have a definitive timeline as to when high-risk fall sports were going to be allowed to play based upon the guidance from the Department of Health and other state officials. So combined with the concerns from the membership, we also had the situation that student athletes were going to start practicing in those high-risk sports without truly understanding when they were going to be able to participate in games. Today's decision gives those student athletes a little bit better of an opportunity to be able to have a quality participation season. We all understand how important interscholastic athletics are to student athletes and communities throughout the state. And if we can afford those student athletes to just play a few games in the spring, then I think we've accomplished our goal, especially considering how many challenges and obstacles our schools are faced with right now.
Kevin Marr asks if you're a school or a section, I guess this would be, if you've already moved a sport a high-risk sport like volleyball or football, how concerned are you about the chances of playing basketball, wrestling, sports with similar risks? Realistically, when is the deadline for that decision made?
Well, the DOH guidance states that authorization or additional guidance will be provided for high-risk sports by December 31st. So we have to be patient. We have to wait. I think right now we have to take into consideration that 130,000 student athletes will be able to start participating in their sport on September 21st in those school districts and in those sections where they determine it to be feasible. So I'm trying to look at this from trying to identify the positives. And when you talk about 130,000 student athletes being able to participate in fall sports right now, where feasible, I think that's certainly something that's beneficial for a lot of student athletes throughout the state of New York.
Okay, David, your question came up twice. So I'm going to skip down to Matt. Will the waiving of the 7-day rule for football stand in March? We covered that as already. I'm sorry, Robert. We already did the 7-day rule. Mark Larson, can you give us any sort of idea on the percentage of ADs that wanted to push back? I guess, meaning, did they want to stay? Did they want to encourage this? What was your feeling on that?
Yeah, I mean, that question wasn't specifically addressed during our 1-hour Zoom meetings, but themes started developing. And when you get the opportunity to talk to almost 500 athletic directors, and you truly get the opportunity to listen to their questions and identify their concerns, it became very evident that we as the High School Athletic Association had to start making some decisions to be of assistance and to be a resource to our member schools. And that's the reason why the decision was made today to push football, volleyball, and competitive cheerleading from the fall to a spring season.
All right, Phil Blackwell came back again, so if I didn't read his question correctly, that's on me, so I'm sorry, Phil. My mind is mush after about a dozen of these in 2 days, so bear with me. His earlier question should have read an end date for fall sports too. Will it be the end of April or does it go into May?
Well, that's up to the discretion of the sections to determine the end date of any season. Our officers today are recommending that the fall season 2 end date be May 1st. And again, that's to reduce the overlap between fall season 2, football and volleyball, and the traditional spring sports, which are scheduled to now start on April 19th.
Okay. Pat Spatafor, what do you anticipate will be different in March rather than now in September that would allow high-risk sports to take place? And is this, sorry, I lost my question, is this a given that these sports will take place?
I don't think anything's a given right now. I think if we lead anybody to believe that anything's a given in the upcoming school year, we're misleading people, and we're certainly not trying to do that. What we're saying is the likelihood of student athletes having a quality participation experience in March in those high-risk sports is better than what it would be to start high-risk sports right now.
Austin asks about September 21st. Do the low-risk sports for this fall have to have 12 practices before their first game can be played? No, in most sports, 10, correct, Robert?
It's 10. Gymnastics is the only low moderate risk sport right now that would require 12 practices before their competition.
All right. Keith Lobdell in the North Country, has the DOH given you any reason why their guidance for high school sports are not more in line with the guidance for the school reopening, especially with the physical education guidelines, which I know has been a frequently asked question?
Yeah, no, we haven't gotten into that type of detail with state officials.
Okay. Mark Larson, are all school districts' decisions on whether or not to play any sports this fall due Friday?
No, there is no deadline. And I know there's an awful lot of rumors going around, but our section directors are doing an incredible job right now with their leadership in their own individual sections. But I'm not aware of any deadlines that schools have to submit their declaration to play by Friday.
Yeah, and to follow on that, any talk of a statewide vote being held to conduct athletics is not a true statement. Individual sections are trying to make their best decisions, but there's a lot of falsities out there right now. So if we can clear those up, certainly let us know. Eugene asked, during that potential 2-week overlap between fall 2 and the spring, would practices during fall 2 count towards the spring?
There are practices within our bylaws that would transfer over. So that is something that we have already accounted for, not as a result of COVID, but that's just part of our normal bylaws that we've had in place for a number of years.
Another poor attempt on my part, I think, to ask a question. Mario came back. He said with the same question, and I'll ask it better this time. What has the state told you that will let those high-risk sports play? Is there a guidance or something that has to happen? You know, vaccine, lower numbers, something of the sort. Can you tell those athletes if so, and so happens to be able to play?
No, I think the guidance that we've received from the Department of Health says that those high-risk sports cannot play games until additional authorization is provided by December 31st. So that's what we're going off of. And I think we have to understand how many obstacles and how many challenges our schools are facing right now. It's not just about interscholastic sports. They have a tremendous challenge ahead of them, and we want to support them in any way that we can. And if this decision today will provide a little bit of relief for those student athletes to ensure that they know that we're thinking of them and we're trying to address their concerns to be able to provide them with a quality season in March, and then also to allow our schools to understand that we're listening to their concerns, then I feel like we've accomplished our goal for today.
All right, poor job on my part, Mario. Sorry, I butchered your question for a second time, but hopefully you got the answer you wanted. It's all blended together. This is a good question from Sal, one that we haven't talked about on these calls yet. So if the fall sports 1 season starts and then games are stopped, could those sports come back in fall season 2 in the spring?
Yes, they certainly could. And we've addressed that on page 41 of our resource document in the frequently asked questions. And that is a great example of one of the questions that I think was asked in all 7 Zoom meetings that we held over the course of the past 2 days. What we've said is, based upon the discretion of the officers of the association, if the fall season 1 that's scheduled to start on September 21st is impacted or interrupted in any form or fashion, then it's up to those officers to examine when it's impacted, how many games, how many weeks have been played, to determine whether it be in the best interest of those students to move it to the spring season, which would now start on March 1st, or consider it a finished season. But that criteria is not hard and fast. It's not quantitative data. What we're looking at is wait and see. If the fall season were to play 8 or 9 weeks and then was interrupted, that would probably constitute a season. If the fall season started on September 21st and was forced to conclude or was suspended in early October, I think the discretion of the officers would be is to take those low and moderate risk sports and then add them to football and volleyball in the spring. But so much is dependent upon how the situation develops. And when we start attempting to predict what's going to happen and start trying to apply criteria for potential decisions in the future, I think we're making life more difficult upon ourselves. I think we have to take the information as it comes to us and make the best decision that we can at that point in time.
Okay, I'm going to combine the next 2 questions, which as of right now are the last 2 in the chat. So if you have anything you want to get into Dr. Zayas, throw it in there now. I mean, we can go for another 20 minutes if we need to, but if we're done early, that would be great too. So Austin and Alexa coming from the same direction. Could a school district or a section pull out of the fall seasons at any time?
Yeah, the hosting or the playing of interscholastic athletics is completely up to the discretion of those school districts and our 11 geographic sections.
Okay. That is the last question in the chat. Oh, and as I say that, here they come. Okay, so back to Austin. If fall 2 teams need 12 practices, does that mean the practices can't start until at least March 17th? I think that would be incorrect, right, Robert?
No, that would be incorrect. The first official practice date would be March 1st.
Okay. Let me get caught back up. That was Austin. Okay, Billy. Back to my previous question. Oh man, did I blow another one? Do you have an understanding why the Department of Health clarifies volleyball and cheer as high risk, understanding that it comes from them, not you? He's just looking for some clarity maybe as to why.
No, we haven't been given that justification. When you look at risk assessment, it could be based upon a number of different parameters. For example, there are some risk assessments from other entities that base their risk assessment on the potential of respiratory droplet spread. Not saying that's what the Department of Health has done, but that's just one example of how intricate the details could be associated with the risk assessment in sports. And keep in mind, the Department of Health are the experts in the field. We're going to take their guidance and follow it as it's written.
All right, I'm going to double back because Austin chimed in and I can actually read it. His previous question, if fall 2 teams need to get 12 practices, does that mean that games cannot start until at least March 17th?
I don't know where you would be getting March 17th.
Yeah.
The way you have to look at it is you could practice for the first week for 6 days, then you got to take 1 day off unless the 7-day practice rule has been waived. Then you can practice another 6 days. That would add up to 12. So the first date that you could probably practice would then be, or play a game would be, I believe, on the 15th day of the season.
So do the math on that and you can get to where you're at if the 7-day rule hasn't been waived. Okay, so that was Austin's second part of the question. Forgive me while I catch up. We did Billy. Okay, Rich Donnelly. Are football and volleyball teams no longer allowed to practice on the 21st? Do they have to wait until fall too, correct?
Well, a school can always have an off-season conditioning workout, but they have to abide by the Department of Health guidance when pertaining to high-risk sports. And I think I read this earlier, that the guidance for high-risk sports when you're conducting a practice right now is that the individuals or distance group training, and they have to be organized in no or low contact group training. So if a coach can accomplish that, that's one thing. We're going to provide that type of detail into our revised Return to Interscholastic Athletics document that we'll be working on tomorrow and distributing to our member schools.
Okay, Lindsey Kramer, any thoughts on the switch of fall football changing out of seasons would affect players who might be trying to get recruited from colleges?
Yeah, I mean, there's an awful lot of states throughout the country that are dealing with this same exact situation. I mean, you look at the number of student athletes that are recruited out of the state of California, and California had to postpone the start of their football season. There's other states that are in the same exact situation. This is not ideal by no means, but we have to make decisions as the State High School Athletic Association that we feel are in the best interest of the student athletes that we serve. And we're in full understanding. I understand this on a daily basis with every decision I'm associated with, is we are not going to have 100% buy-in from the general public. That is never our goal. It's never my goal to please everyone with every decision we make. It is my goal, however, to make decisions that I believe, with my experience, is in the best interest of the student athletes that I'm hired to serve.
Kevin wanted you to kind of re-clarify the face mask toleration rule. I know you said you don't need a doctor's note, you don't need parents' permission. It's an individual student athlete decision, right?
Yeah, and the guidance from the Department of Health is very clear. And we have it mentioned, I believe, 4 or 5 times in the resource document that we provided to our member schools on Friday evening. The Department of Health says if you cannot maintain 6 feet social distance, you're required to wear a face covering unless the student cannot tolerate the face covering during physical activity. At nowhere in the guidance does it stipulate anything about a doctor's note, a physician's written notice, or anything like that. So that's the guidance provided by the Department of Health. And as I mentioned earlier, it's the same exact guidance, word for word, provided to all youth sports for summer activity and play that they've been following for the last couple months.
Matt wanted to know how far ahead of the winter and spring seasons could you expect to get sports-specific safety guidelines?
I mean, I think it's a day-by-day decision, and it's a day-by-day process. And I don't think that we can look too far ahead. We're working on a daily basis as this situation develops. I mean, we work on behalf of almost 600,000 student athletes. We truly understand the responsibility. We're trying our best to get as much information distributed to our member schools as possible on a daily basis. So as soon as that guidance is readily available, we're going to disseminate it to our member schools.
Okay, a couple more in the chat. I think we're coming to the end. Hopefully, if you are desperate for anything, please let us know. But I think we've kind of covered a lot of bases here, so we're in the final 5. Keith Lobdell, did any of the northern officials have concerns about trying to have football have football in the season in mid-March? Last spring, we had a break in the weather. Usually, it's snowy and frozen. Is that a concern not only in the North Country but all over the state?
Yeah, it's definitely a concern. I mean, I'm going to be praying for the warmest winter in the history of New York State. So I think it's a concern. It's a reality of the situation. It's one of the obstacles that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to have to monitor the weather as we get to that point in the season. But again, this is not an ideal situation, but nothing has really been ideal for the past 6 months. We're trying our best to provide participation opportunities for students with the obstacles and challenges placed before them.
All right, Liana asks about football coaches specifically in the fall. What kind of contact can they have with their student athletes? I think in lieu of having a true practice in the fall, what can a football coach do right now with his student athletes?
Yeah, any off-season conditioning workouts would be allowed as long as they abide by the Department of Health guidance. No, and I want to stress this, no interscholastic events hosted or operated by the school can be held prior to September 21st. And that's a major point of emphasis that we provided to those athletic directors we spoke to for the past 2 days.
Rachel asked a question that I don't want to think about yet because we just made the announcement today, but potentially delaying. I don't want to have to worry about that yet, but at what point would student athletes risking playing in the snow on the ground and, issues with that delay the fall season into the spring?
Yeah, I think it's way too early to tell. I mean, this decision is a few hours old. I think we're going to go ahead and realize that, again, we're making decisions based upon readily available information. And with the diverse climates that we have here in New York State, Long Island may be fine. The capital region may be fine. Western New York and Central New York may be difficult in the month of March. That, again, is a reality that we're going to have to deal with as we get closer to that start of the football and volleyball seasons, as we prepare to move those sports to the spring season.
All right, let's call these the final two questions of the night. Chet Davis, any sections, and maybe Robert, you just want to give an update, any sections or member schools having votes on whether or not to play fall sports? Do you want to give an update, kind of a statewide perspective on other sections about what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, each section is looking at this. They're examining the situation as it pertains to their member schools. So right now, Section 8 in Nassau County made the very difficult decision a couple of weeks ago to go ahead and postpone their fall sports and winter sports season until the start date being January 4th. No other section, to my knowledge, has made a definitive decision yet, but it is my understanding that all sections are discussing schedules and the COVID crisis as it's going to impact the fall season, potentially the beginning of the winter season. So each section is doing a great job of examining as much as they can to provide guidance and schedules to their member schools.
Okay, last question, Rob Crone. Watertown and Indian River have elected not to play fall sports this season, hearing that some of the reasoning would be budget cuts by the state. Can you comment? I don't know if you can necessarily comment on state budget cuts, but you want to give your thoughts on, budget cuts or budget impacts across the board?
I mean, right now, the job of a school superintendent is probably one of the most difficult jobs in the country. And we have the utmost respect for our school superintendents. We understand there's challenges and obstacles that they're going to have to overcome just to get students to be able to be educated in their school buildings. So when you talk about the budget cuts, those school superintendents are doing all they can to provide quality education programs for their students, and then where they determine it to be feasible, provide athletic opportunities for their students as well.
All right, that was the last question in the chat. So at this time, I think that kind of concludes where we're at. Obviously, if you need anything, please reach out to me. Let me know if you need further information or clarity on anything. And if you need anything from us in the future, you know where to find us. But thanks for carving out some time on a Wednesday night, late night, and hopefully everybody can hit their deadlines from here. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Stay safe.